At Sandy Hook Elementary and his mother in her home before committing suicide. A rabbi presided at Noah's service, and in keeping with Jewish tradition, the boy was laid to rest in a simple brown wooden casket with the Star of David on it. If Noah had not been taken from us, he would have become a great man. He would have been a wonderful husband and a loving father. Noah's uncle, Alexis Haller, told mourners, according to remarks he provided to the Associated Press. Both services were closed to the news media. So we come to church on this morning, and probably most of us were in a pretty good mood. And then, you hear words like that and are reminded of a time not that long ago when one of the most tragic stories imaginable unfolded for us. And how that ties in to the very last words of this morning's gospel lesson may not be obvious. In fact, it's not obvious at all, I suppose. But I will try and do something with that for us. Because those last words are, for many are called, but few are chosen. And, we can ponder that deeply and look things up in our, Bibles and the notations and all that. But really, when we come to look at words like that, as we hold them in the context of our Orthodox Christian faith, we don't have to really do a lot of biblical research to know what's being said there in a larger kind of setting. Because one thing we know about who's called is that everyone is called. Everyone, every last one of us, human beings that can even hear a call, are called. And when we come to the few are chosen part, that's where we get to take a little bit of a look at how that choosing happens. It's nice to think, or it's easy to fall into thinking that somehow God does the choosing. But no, that's not really quite accurate, because, again, it only makes the most of logical sense that God offers everything to everyone, and the choosing is our response to that. So it is a self-choosing. It's a self-distinction that sets us apart as either chosen or not chosen. We get to do that. And how might that be described in a kind of simple fashion, as far as where we begin and where we may end up? Well, it's as simple as hearing those words from this newspaper might be difficult. And it comes to us in a question that we hear pretty much every day, unless we just hide in our room on some days. The question is, how are you? How are you? And what's the first place we look to see how I am? I mean, I can look today and say, I have a cold. They might be asking about my cold. So I'm not so good. I'm sick. Of course, when we look from there, we get to recognize that the way that we answer that question is usually, again, some sort of self-assessment about if I'm getting what I want, or if I'm not getting what I want, or if I'm getting something that I don't want. And it's a very unconscious kind of thing that we do if we answer that question at that level. But I think if we're going to be honest, probably most of the time that's about where we come from. We come from a place that assesses how are you according to my likes and my dislikes, my preferences. And we find that that doesn't end up being a very satisfying place to come from. Because what do I do if these kinds of things are happening? I'm doomed. And what do I do when I'm not getting what I want? I get resentful of people who have what I want, jealous. I look around and I judge everyone and everything all the time, because I'm only basing my experience or answer to the question, how are you, on how I feel. Not a very good place to look. So one of the things that many of you have heard me suggest, and that I try and do, and that I'm reminded every time somebody asks me, how are you, Father John, is to answer a question back. Compared to what? Compared to what? When I start comparing something like this time in our weekly life to how I'm doing right now, well, I'm probably doing better than this. And when I compare how I'm doing right now to, 2000, when did I have my prostate removed? I don't remember. But, I was standing up here probably 7 years or so ago, or in that territory, telling you I was headed off to surgery. Compared to that, I'm doing real good. And so with the comparisons, I can at least be thankful for kind of dodging some of the bullets that are out there in life. But when we look at really what being chosen means, what it means for us to be stepping from darkness into the light, to be coming out of sleep into awakenedness, what we find is that there's in our church's tradition, in our Antiochian church's tradition particularly, and it might not even apply only to the Christian Middle East, but what do you hear? If you're a Middle Easterner and you ask someone the question, how are you? What will the answer be very often? Thank God. Thank God. Nishkar Allah. Now, that may not be an expression of the person's real perspective on how they are, but it sure is a wonderful, beautiful expression of what comes first and what we know before anything. And that if we work toward knowing, thank God, as my answer to anybody's question about anything about the conditions of me and the world around me. It always starts with thank God. Every Sunday we hear about saints. We look on the walls and we see people who, by the measure of how are you when you're getting your intestines ripped out, how are you? Thank God. When you find yourself compared to other people, how are you? Well, the saints expressed how they were in a very beautiful kind of way. It was always thank God. St. John Chrysostom's last words when he died, glory to God for all things. So what it means for us to be chosen is for us to be choosing how we are going to respond to the world as it will unfold before us. Because as we've all noticed, it doesn't really care what we think about how things are. The universe doesn't ask us. God doesn't ask us. Our neighbor doesn't ask us. Nobody checks with us on how things ought to be. If they did, we could tell them. And we could, all the way up to God, give him some good direction and instruction on how the world ought to be. Because we know that this one's a mess. But if I can move away from simply my preferences, and again, all of these things can be twisted and manipulated to look as though they're well-intended. But when we have a question that comes out of that first perspective, people are always asking, how could there be a God when these kinds of things can happen? Not a bad question, but people who ask that question are usually just crying out of their pain, not really interested in much of an answer. Because an answer is going to demand something. And to move up to my being able to recognize that I can actually think about these things. I can recognize as a step upward in my response to that question, in how I move from simply being called to being chosen. I can pay attention and look and see that yes, there are other people on the planet, and there is suffering way greater than mine. And that can be, at least in the beginning, a little bit of a comfort. So when we're called to or instructed, or it's suggested to us to make a gratitude list, how often those gratitude lists are comparison things. And they're still based a little bit on what I like and what I don't like, but they're a step in the right direction. It at least acknowledges that I need to be thankful. But if we're really going to be listening to the message that is delivered to us in the witness of the saints, we find that, man, it's still not very satisfying there. Because life, again, isn't always going to give me happy comparisons. I mean, we were here at church last week hearing a confession from a young man, one of our own, who's in trouble right now, who's struggling. That's not a happy Sunday to be here, is it? Well, it depends. Because again, in the Nishtarala sense, into the glory to God for all things, in just a flat-out thank God, if we start there, there's nowhere else to go. We've arrived. We've been chosen. And as we work on truly moving ever more deeply into what that means, that all we ever do, again, to be reminded, we come to church for what? For Holy Communion, for Eucharisto, the Eucharist. Thank you in Greek. That's all it is. We come to say thank you. Now, in light of that, we should all be kind of, a little bit with our heads down. Because for the most part, we aren't very good at thank you all the time. Because the world, the culture, the societies that we live in, all will tell us that that's not reasonable. It's not even human. To talk about these kinds of things as though we can literally transcend them all. You bet we can. It's what we're made for. And in fact, all of these things, all of the events of last week are given to us on purpose. Now, they're not given to us in terms of trying to torture us or make us feel bad, but given the sin of the world, given, as we heard in today's liturgical texts, all the way back to Adam, well, right from the very first moment, virtually, of our existence, we go astray. We want to do things our way. Our self-centeredness begins to get a hold of us. And so we want things our way. And that's understandable. But what we find all over the place in Scripture, in the big story, is that it's so much larger than this, so much deeper than this, and will require so much more work than most of us are willing to put in most of the time. But two simple places where I always go with these kinds of things. That beautiful story that we learned as children, that people had our little child Bibles, our children's Bibles, because one of the things, especially if it was in color, what could you be better than a Technicolor Coat for a children's book of colored pictures? And you got Joseph, sold by his brothers into slavery, thought by them to probably be dead, and then they encounter him. They encounter him in Egypt where there's a famine and they've come looking for food to take and save the lives of the people. And his brothers, when they discover who he is, are shaking in their shoes because he's a prince in Egypt now. And he has every possibility of just saying, off with their heads. And he doesn't fall into any kind of, oh, it's okay, don't worry about it. No, his words toward the ends of the book of Genesis are to his brothers, no. You meant it for evil. You didn't want to kill me per se, but you meant to kill me, get rid of me. But God meant it for good, so that lives could be saved. And if we don't have that attitude right now, with everything in our lives, then we know we have work to do. And my guess would be, if I can use my own experience for any measure, yeah, most of us aren't quite there yet. And then again, simple words from St. Paul, when he points out to us that we know, he says, that all things work together for good to those who love God. Once again, how is it that such a simple little phrase can go so unminded by us, that we can miss it, that we can literally push it to the side, because we're probably a little afraid of what it will require, or we just don't believe that God can work that kind of miracle in me. And it's a legitimate kind of concern, and I guess I might add too, that in many ways, we're just too darn comfortable for our own good. We have been blessed. So as we come here and as we hear these words of many being called, a few chosen, and as we look at those possibilities as to how we self-select ourselves by virtue of how we respond to every circumstance of life, and as we consider that we begin kind of unconscious, just like a little dog that knows if it's getting petted or if it's getting kicked, it knows if it's being fed or if it's being neglected. As we move up to a place where we can more consciously look around us and realize that the world is full of suffering, and ours may not be the worst, as we sometimes bemoan and bewail our situation. With the possibility then, because again, that's better than the first step, but no, we've got some real distance to travel. Impossible distance to travel left to our own devices. But by the grace of God, exactly what we are designed for. So let us, brothers and sisters, as we head for this feast of the Nativity of Christ, let us try and be braver than we're used to being. Let us consider what acting more courageously and more stoutly would look like in our lives. And again, our lives for the most part don't offer us that many wonderful opportunities to work at this stuff. So we have to work a little harder at realizing that this is the job, the battle, the war, however we want to describe it, put before us to move from being the called to being chosen. Amen. Help us, save us, have mercy on us, and keep us, O God, by thy grace. Wisdom, that guarded always by thy mightiness, cry the glory unto thee, to the Father, and to the Son, and to the Holy Spirit.